I didn't think the moment my family stopped seeing me as their daughter would happen over something as small as a garden shed. Not a fight about money, not an affair, not betrayal between spouses. A shed. 3 weeks ago, my mother tried to punch my husband in the face in our backyard while my father stood there and watched. An hour later, the police were in our driveway. By the end of the week, my parents had filed a restraining order against my husband, claiming he was violent, dangerous, and a threat to their safety. None of it was true, but somehow I was still the one everyone blamed. My phone hasn't stopped buzzing since. Aunts, cousins, family, friends, people who watched me grow up telling me I was ungrateful, cold, disloyal, that I chose a man over my own blood. They never asked what actually happened. They never asked why my mother lunged at my husband with her fist raised. They never asked why my brother lied in court. They never asked why my father nodded along while my husband's reputation was dragged through the dirt. They just decided I was the villain. I'm Becca. I'm 28 years old. I've been with my husband Benjamin for 5 years, married for 4 months. And until recently, I believed that family, no matter how flawed, would always protect its own. I was wrong. Because when control is threatened, love can turn into something sharp. When boundaries are set, gratitude becomes an accusation. And when a daughter grows into a woman who refuses to bend, she becomes a problem that needs to be corrected. The shed wasn't about storage. It wasn't about permission. It wasn't even about respect. It was about my mother realizing she no longer decided what my life looked like. And when she lost that power, she was willing to lie to the police, lie to a judge, and destroy my marriage to get it back. I didn't walk away from my family lightly. I didn't choose this conflict. But standing there in a courtroom, listening to people who raised me describe my husband as a monster, while knowing they were lying, I understood something I had avoided my whole life. Some families don't break when you do something wrong. They break when you stop letting them hurt you. And once that happens, there's no going back to who you were before the restraining order, before the police lights splashing blue across the driveway, before my mother looked at my husband like he was an intruder in her kingdom. There was a version of my life that almost looked normal. If you'd met me a year and a half ago, you would have thought I was doing the right thing. The responsible daughter, the one who didn't run when her parents needed help, the one who came back home. Not because she had to, but because she was asked. My parents begged us to move in. That's the part my family keeps skipping over when they tell the story now. My dad, Jack, was 56 when his back finally gave out for good. He'd worked construction most of his life, the kind of labor that eats away at your body slowly, like rust. One day he came home pale, stiff, moving like every breath hurt. Then came scans, doctors, physical therapy, and the quiet admission that he couldn't do heavy lifting anymore. My mom, Camila, was 54. She sounded calm when she asked, but her calm always had a hook in it, like she was offering you something generous, while already preparing the guilt if you said no. Move in for a while, she said. Help us with bills. Help your dad. It'll only be temporary. Temporary. That word has a way of stretching in families like mine. Benjamin and I agreed because, honestly, it made sense. We'd been together 5 years, married 4 months ago, but even before the wedding, we were trying to save for our own place. Living with my parents meant we could put money aside faster. It meant I could be close to Dad while he recovered. It meant my parents wouldn't have to pretend they were okay when they weren't. And it meant, if I'm being honest, I still wanted to be the good daughter in my mother's eyes, because I've been chasing that approval since I was 17. 17 was the year I learned how quickly family responsibility becomes code for my responsibility. Dad got injured back then too, another construction accident, and he was off work for 8 months. My mother acted like she was holding everything together, but she wasn't. Most days, she was at her sister's house, or running errands, or disappearing into long conversations that always ended with her laughing in another room while I was reheating soup for Dad and checking if my little brother had done his homework. Michael was 15 at the time. He's 24 now. And if you want to understand why my mother could lie to a judge with a straight face later, you have to understand Michael's role in our family. Michael was allowed to be messy, allowed to be reckless, allowed to be just a kid. When I missed homecoming because Dad had physical therapy, no one thanked me. When I missed prom because Michael was acting up and my mother didn't want to deal with him, no one apologized. When Michael got caught shoplifting at 15, my mother didn't blame him. She blamed me. You should have been watching him, she snapped, like I was the one who raised him. That was the pattern. Michael fell, I was supposed to catch him. My mother spun it as loyalty, as duty, as being a good daughter. So when she asked us to move in, that old wiring in my chest tightened automatically. Say yes, don't cause problems, keep the peace, be useful, be needed. Benjamin didn't have that wiring. He didn't grow up inside my mother's atmosphere. He grew up with boundaries. That was one of the reasons I loved him. Benjamin is 29. He works at an auto shop, hands always smelling faintly like metal and soap, fingernails never perfectly clean, no matter how hard he scrubs. He's the kind of man who doesn't perform goodness. He just does the work quietly and expects nothing for it. And that kind of steady, unflashy competence is exactly what my mother couldn't stand. Because Benjamin started helping my family before we even moved in. Weekends, he'd show up with tools, fix a loose railing, patch a leak, replace a broken latch. He rebuilt my parents' porch steps one summer when they started collapsing. He painted the entire exterior of the house, hours in the sun, sweat darkening his shirt, my mother sitting inside like she was supervising an employee. Not once did she say thank you. Not once did my father look him in the eye and say, I appreciate you. They just pointed. A faucet dripping, a door sticking, a cabinet hinge loose. Benjamin would nod like, okay, and he'd fix that too. And I told myself it was fine. I told myself my parents weren't good at showing gratitude. I told myself they were stressed, that they weren't trying to be rude. But looking back, I can see it clearer now. My mother didn't want a son-in-law. She wanted a worker she could control. When we moved in a year and a half ago, we paid them $500 a month. We bought our own groceries. We helped with utilities. Benjamin still fixed things around the house almost every day after coming home from work tired. And the more he contributed, the more my mother criticized. If he rewired the kitchen outlets, she complained the bathroom fan was too loud. If he fixed that, she found something else wrong. If he organized a shelf, she rearranged it and then complained he was messy. And my dad? My dad did what he always did. He stayed quiet. He grunted. He shrugged. He let my mother be the voice of the house. Which meant, without saying it directly, he let her decide who belonged and who didn't. The shift got sharper after our wedding in January. That's when the comments started. Not the kind you can argue with easily, not direct insults, the kind of little cuts that make you feel crazy if you react. He left his coffee cup in the sink. He watches TV too loud. He takes long showers. She started timing him. Timing. Like she was collecting proof of something. Like she was preparing a case before anyone even knew there would be a trial. Our wedding gifts piled up in the spare bedroom upstairs. Kitchen appliances, picture frames, linens. My parents told us to put everything there until we moved out. We stacked everything neatly, untouched, because we were still trying to find an apartment. Months passed. Then suddenly, 2 weeks before the shed incident, my mother flipped the script. Now the spare room was too full. Now our things were in her way. Now she needed that space. Every day she brought it up. At breakfast, passing me in the hallway, while I was folding laundry, like a drip, drip, drip that never stopped until the wall finally cracked. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed one night, staring at the pile of boxes we'd carefully organized and feeling the stress tight in my throat. Benjamin stood in the doorway, rubbing the back of his neck, eyes scanning the room. We could get a storage shed, he said gently. Small one. Put it in the corner of the yard. Keep everything safe and dry. It sounded so reasonable, so normal. We found one at a home improvement store for $400, about the size of a large closet, just enough for wedding gifts and a few extra things. We bought it on a Saturday. Benjamin assembled it on Sunday. He placed it in the corner of the yard where it wouldn't block anything, where it wouldn't ruin the view, where it wasn't in anyone's way. We thought we were solving a problem. We thought we were being considerate. But we didn't understand yet that the problem wasn't our boxes. The problem was that my mother didn't want solutions unless she was the one who controlled them. And the moment she saw that shed, solid, practical, already standing, something in her snapped. That was the moment the story stopped being about storage and started being about power. If I had known how carefully my mother was building her case against us, I might have recognized the warning signs sooner. But when you grow up inside a family like mine, tension doesn't arrive with sirens. It creeps in through tone, through pauses, through the way someone looks at you just a second too long before speaking. The shed didn't appear out of nowhere. The conflict had been fermenting for months. After the wedding, my mother started watching Benjamin the way people watch strangers in their house. Not openly hostile, worse than that, observant, measuring, like she was waiting for him to slip. She'd move things he organized, then complain he was careless. She'd suggest a better way to fix something after he'd already finished it. She'd sigh loudly when he walked into a room, like his presence was an inconvenience she was forced to tolerate. Benjamin noticed, of course. He just didn't make it my problem. That's who he is. He'd come back to our room at night, shoulders tight, jaw clenched, and when I asked if everything was okay, he'd shrug. "She's stressed," he'd say. "I don't want to make things harder for you." Those words, "for you," sat heavy in my chest, because I knew exactly what he was absorbing so I wouldn't have to. The thing about my mother is that she rarely confronts directly. She plants discomfort and lets it grow. She repeats complaints until they become facts. She frames control as concern. "I just worry about the house," she'd say. "I just think guests should be more mindful." I'm just saying, ish. When you live with other people, you have to respect their space. Always plural. People. Never naming Benjamin outright. And every time my father nodded, not loudly, not aggressively, but enough. Enough to make it clear whose side he was on. Michael, meanwhile, was still living in the basement, untouched by scrutiny. He didn't pay rent, didn't fix anything, didn't contribute consistently. Sometimes he worked, sometimes he didn't. He borrowed money from my parents constantly. When my dad discovered Michael had been using his credit card to buy things online, over $3,000 worth, my parents paid it off and never spoke of it again. No confrontation, no lecture, no accountability. But Benjamin left a coffee mug in the sink, and suddenly it was evidence of disrespect. That imbalance didn't just bother me. It rewired something in me. Because for the first time, I wasn't the one being blamed. Benjamin was. And watching someone I loved be treated the way I had been treated growing up made it impossible to keep pretending this was normal. 2 weeks before the shed incident, my mother's complaints about the spare bedroom intensified. Every day. "You need to move your things." "I can't use that room." "I don't know why you need so much space." I tried to explain there was nowhere else. The basement was damp. The garage was full. We were actively applying for apartments. She didn't want explanations. She wanted obedience. When Benjamin suggested the shed, we genuinely thought we were doing what she wanted, freeing up the room without asking her to sacrifice anything. Looking back, that was our mistake. Because the shed wasn't just a solution. It was a decision made without her permission. And that crossed an invisible line she had drawn years ago without telling me. The morning she saw it, I was already at work. Benjamin told me later that he heard the back door slam. He said her footsteps were fast, sharp against the patio stones. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't ask why we got it. She started yelling the second she saw it. "What is that? Who said you could put that in my yard? How much did this cost?" Benjamin tried to explain calmly. He told her about the storage issues she'd been complaining about. He told her we bought it ourselves. He told her we could move it or return it if it was really a problem. That's when she turned it into something else entirely. She started screaming that it was her house, her yard, that we were guests who didn't get to make decisions. She called Benjamin a freeloader, said he never helped, said he ruined more than he fixed, said he had no respect for her home. 10 minutes. He stood there and took it for 10 full minutes. No raised voice, no insults back, no defensiveness. Finally, he said something that should have ended the conversation. "If it's that big of a problem," he said quietly, "we'll return it." That's when my mother lost control. Because suddenly, she wasn't the one withholding permission. She was being offered an option. And that meant she wasn't in charge anymore. By the time I got home, the air was already thick. I could feel it the moment I stepped inside. The house felt smaller, like the walls were leaning inward, waiting. My mother didn't greet me. She didn't need to. I could hear her voice outside, sharp, cutting through the yard. I walked out just in time to see her pointing at Benjamin, listing his supposed failures like charges being read aloud. Then she turned on me. She said I'd changed, that I used to be respectful, that marrying Benjamin had made me selfish, that he was turning me against my own family. She dragged up things from years ago, tiny moments she'd stored away like ammunition. The time I came home late from work at 22, the years I lived in my own apartment and didn't visit enough, the way I wasn't as available as I used to be. My father stood beside her, listening, agreeing. When she finished, he said, calmly, like this was reasonable, that maybe we should start looking harder for our own place. As if we hadn't already been doing exactly that. As if we weren't already planning to leave. That's when Benjamin spoke again. He mentioned the apartment applications, the rent we paid, the groceries, the utilities, the contributions. Not defensively, not angrily, factually. And something in my mother broke. She charged at him, fist raised, face twisted with something I didn't recognize and never want to see again. My father grabbed her arm. Benjamin stepped back. And in that moment, right before the police were called, right before everything escalated beyond repair, I understood something terrifying. This wasn't about the shed. This wasn't about respect. This wasn't even about family. This was about control slipping through her fingers, and she was willing to hurt anyone who stood in the way of getting it back. The sound of my mother's scream didn't fade when my father pulled her back. It sharpened. It cut through the yard, through the open windows, through something inside me that had spent years convincing itself this family was just difficult, not dangerous. I remember the exact way Benjamin shifted his weight backward, palms open, instinctively defensive without being aggressive. I remember the way my heart slammed so hard it made my ears ring. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the neighbors must be able to hear this. My mother kept yelling that Benjamin was disrespectful, that he was trying to take over her house, that he had turned me against her. I stepped between them, my hands shaking, telling her to stop, telling her this was out of control, telling her we could talk about it later. She didn't look at me like I was her daughter. She looked at me like I was a traitor. My father finally said he was calling the police. At the time, I thought that might calm things down. I was wrong. When the police arrived, the energy shifted instantly. My mother straightened her posture, her voice softened. Her hands started trembling, not with rage now, but with something carefully chosen. Fear. She told the officers that Benjamin had been threatening her for weeks, that he made her feel unsafe in her own home, that he had been aggressive and intimidating. I felt like I was standing outside my own body. None of it was true, not one word. Benjamin and I were taken aside and asked to explain what happened. We told the truth, about the shed, about her yelling, about her charging at him. One of the officers looked tired. He glanced at the shed, then back at us. He asked who paid for it. Benjamin showed the receipt. The officer nodded slowly and said it sounded like a family disagreement that had escalated. But my mother wouldn't let it end there. She insisted Benjamin was dangerous, that she was afraid, that she wanted him gone immediately. My father backed her up. Michael came outside and started yelling too, calling Benjamin an outsider, saying he never belonged, saying we should have left months ago. The police said no arrest could be made because no assault had actually happened. But then came the suggestion. Maybe it would be best if he stayed somewhere else for a few days, one officer said carefully. My parents jumped on it. They said they wanted a temporary restraining order. I packed a bag that night with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Benjamin didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just grabbed his jacket and met my eyes, silently asking what I wanted to do. I chose him. We left together. At the motel across town, my phone exploded. Messages poured in from relatives who hadn't spoken to me in months. All of them had already decided who was right and who was wrong. I was ungrateful. I was selfish. I was choosing a man over my own blood. No one asked what actually happened. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday. In that courtroom, my mother cried. My father nodded along. My brother lied without blinking. Michael told the judge Benjamin had thrown tools, had yelled, had been aggressive for months. When asked for dates, he couldn't give any. When asked for specifics, his story shifted. Still, the judge granted a temporary restraining order to be safe. Benjamin had to stay 500 feet away from my parents' house for 30 days. That week, we drained most of our savings on a furnished apartment. I went back alone to collect clothes. My mother offered me coffee like nothing had happened, like she hadn't just tried to destroy my marriage. That was when it hit me. She believed her version of events. And that meant the truth didn't matter anymore. The first night in the furnished apartment, I didn't sleep. The place smelled like disinfectant and someone else's life. Beige walls, generic art, a couch that sagged in the middle, like it had already given up. Benjamin fell asleep eventually, exhaustion finally winning, but I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in brutal, perfect clarity. My mother's raised fist, my father's silence, Michael's lies said with confidence, like practice. I kept thinking there had to be a moment I missed, some sentence I could have worded better, some reaction I could have softened, some way I could have prevented it all. That thought is dangerous, because it makes you believe responsibility equals control. And I had spent most of my life believing that lie. The next few days moved in a blur of logistics and quiet grief, calls with lawyers, emails to landlords, packing lists, calculating money in my head until numbers lost meaning. Benjamin never once said, "This is your fault." He didn't even say, "I told you so." Instead, he made coffee in the tiny kitchenette every morning and asked me what I needed that day. Not what my parents needed, not what my family wanted. Me, That alone made me cry harder than anything else. At night, when the world finally slowed down, the doubt crept in. What if I had just apologized? What if I had convinced Benjamin to apologize, even if he didn't mean it? What if keeping the peace was worth swallowing one more injustice? Those thoughts didn't come from nowhere. They came from a lifetime of training. My mother raised me to believe that harmony mattered more than truth, that discomfort should be absorbed quietly, that standing up for yourself was the same thing as being selfish. And now the cost of not following those rules was terrifyingly clear. A restraining order, a courtroom, a family that wouldn't speak to me. I found myself asking questions I hated. Was I choosing the harder path just to prove a point? Was this really worth losing my parents over a shed? But every time those doubts took shape, something else answered them. The way my mother lied without hesitation. The way my father defended those lies in the name of marriage. The way Michael treated perjury like a favor. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a pattern finally exposed under fluorescent courtroom lights. When I went back to the house alone to pack more things, the disconnect was surreal. My mother chatted about groceries and weather. She asked if I was eating enough. She acted like the restraining order was a minor inconvenience, not a legal accusation that could have ruined my husband's life. When I confronted her, quietly, directly, she didn't deny lying. She reframed it. I felt unsafe, she said. That's my truth. No examples, no specifics, just feelings elevated above facts. That was the moment something inside me went still. Because you can argue with denial, you can reason with confusion, but you cannot negotiate with someone who believes their emotions justify any action. Benjamin listened when I told him what she said. He didn't interrupt. He didn't rage. He just exhaled slowly and said something that settled deep in my chest. She's not going to change. He wasn't angry when he said it. He was certain. And certainty is clarifying in a way anger never is. I realized then that the real grief wasn't about losing my parents. It was about losing the hope that they might one day be different. That maybe, if I was patient enough, quiet enough, useful enough, they'd finally see me as someone worth respecting. That hope died quietly in that conversation. And as painful as it was, it also brought relief. Because for the first time, I stopped asking what I could do better and started asking what I was willing to tolerate. Once the restraining order was in place, my family didn't calm down. They doubled down. That was the part I hadn't expected. I thought, naively, that after court, after the embarrassment, after seeing a judge question their story, something might crack. Some hesitation, some shame. Instead, they closed ranks. The narrative shifted almost overnight. It wasn't just that my mother had felt unsafe anymore. Now Benjamin had been aggressive for a long time. Now there were patterns. Now people were saying they'd always been worried about him. People who had never once checked on me before. My phone filled with messages that all sounded eerily similar, like they'd been workshopped together. You've changed. He's isolating you. You used to be such a good daughter. We're just worried about you. Concern dressed up as accusation. Every explanation I tried to give was dismissed as excuses. When I said my mother tried to hit Benjamin, they said I was exaggerating. When I said Michael lied in court, they said he was protecting his family. When I said my father backed those lies, they said that's what marriage is, standing by your spouse. No one asked why standing by my spouse suddenly made me disloyal. The pressure was relentless. My aunt told me I needed to apologize, even if I didn't mean it. A cousin said Benjamin was probably manipulating me and I couldn't see it yet. A family friend suggested I come home alone to cool off. They all framed it the same way. If I would just separate myself from Benjamin, things could go back to normal. That was when I finally understood something. They weren't trying to resolve conflict. They were trying to remove the obstacle, and that obstacle was my husband. The second hearing, the one for the permanent restraining order, came faster than I expected. This time, Benjamin's lawyer was prepared. He had photos of every repair Benjamin had done, receipts for materials Benjamin paid for himself, messages from my mother that contradicted her claims of fear. The judge asked questions my parents didn't like. Why, if Benjamin was dangerous? Had they let him live there for over a year? Why hadn't they called the police earlier? Why did the accusations only surface after an argument about a shed? Michael shifted in his seat. My mother cried again. My father tried to reframe everything as misunderstandings. The judge denied the permanent restraining order. She warned them about filing false reports. That should have been the end. It wasn't. That night, my mother texted me that I had humiliated the family, that I had chosen strangers over blood, that I was no longer welcome in her home until I came to my senses. My father called later and told me families fight, but they forgive. that I was throwing everything away over pride, that they wouldn't be around forever. And then he said something that locked everything into place. Marriage means backing your spouse, he said, even when they're wrong. I asked him if that applied to my marriage too. He didn't answer. Instead, he told me I owed my parents more loyalty than I owed my husband. That was the moment I stopped trying to explain myself. Because escalation doesn't always look like yelling. Sometimes it looks like everyone insisting you're unreasonable for refusing to accept what's clearly wrong. And once I saw that, I knew the next phase wouldn't be about surviving the conflict. It would be about deciding who I was willing to lose. There's a moment after chaos when everything goes quiet, but not peaceful. It's the kind of quiet where you can hear your own breathing too clearly, where the absence of noise feels heavier than the screaming ever did. That was the phase I fell into after the judge denied the restraining order. The legal threat was gone, but the damage stayed. My parents stopped calling altogether. My mother didn't send her long messages anymore. My father didn't check in. Michael disappeared into silence, except through the stories that filtered back to me through other people. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like grief without permission. Because when a family cuts you off, they don't just take themselves with them. They take the version of you that existed around them. The daughter who tried harder, the sister who cleaned up messes, the woman who believed loyalty meant endurance. I didn't know who I was without that role. Some nights, I lay awake next to Benjamin and stared at the edge of the bed, tracing invisible lines with my eyes, wondering if this emptiness meant I had made the wrong choice. Not because Benjamin had done anything wrong. He hadn't. But because loss has a way of making even the healthiest decisions feel like mistakes. I missed my dad in ways that surprised me. The quiet mornings when he'd sit at the kitchen table reading the news. The rare moments he'd smile at something I said, like he was proud but didn't quite know how to show it. That loss cut deeper than my anger. Because he could have stopped this. He could have told the truth. He could have stepped in. He could have said, enough. Instead, he chose peace with my mother over integrity with his daughter. And that hurt more than her lies ever could. Benjamin noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself. I started second-guessing everything. I reread old text messages. I replayed conversations, trying to find a version of reality where everyone could be right and no one had to take responsibility. I even caught myself wondering, briefly, shamefully, if Benjamin would be better off without me. Without the baggage, without the family fallout. That thought scared me, because it sounded exactly like the kind of thinking my mother had trained into me. Your needs are the problem. One night, Benjamin reached for my hand and said something simple. You don't have to fix this. I broke. I cried harder than I had at any point since the shed incident. Not loud, dramatic sobs. Quiet, shaking breaths. The kind that come from holding yourself together for too long. I told him I felt like I'd lost my entire family in 1 year. I told him I felt guilty for not feeling guiltier. I told him I didn't know how to exist without constantly managing someone else's emotions. He listened. He didn't interrupt. And when I finished, he said something that settled into me slowly, like medicine. You didn't lose them. They stepped away when they couldn't control you. That was my lowest point. Not because I was alone, but because I finally accepted that no amount of patience, silence, or sacrifice would bring back the version of my family I wished existed. And once you accept that, there's no pretending anymore. There's only the question of what comes next. The turning point didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, almost disappointingly so. It happened on a Tuesday evening, while I was folding laundry in our new apartment, the hum of the dryer filling the room. Benjamin was in the kitchen cooking dinner, the smell of garlic and oil drifting down the hallway. Ordinary. Safe. My phone buzzed. It was my father. I stared at his name longer than I should have. Part of me still expected the call to be an olive branch, an apology, a moment of clarity. When I answered, his voice sounded tired. He didn't ask how I was. He told me my mother was struggling, that she wasn't sleeping, that she felt abandoned, that she didn't understand how things had gone so wrong. Then he asked if I could just come by for a bit, alone. He said it didn't have to be about the court or the shed or the lies. He said we could focus on moving forward. That was when I finally heard what he wasn't saying. There was no acknowledgement of harm, no accountability, no recognition of what they had done to Benjamin or to me. Moving forward, in his language, meant pretending nothing happened. It meant returning to my role. It meant accepting that my mother's feelings mattered more than the truth. I told him no. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. I said I wasn't willing to have a relationship built on denial. I said I needed honesty and accountability before anything else could happen. He went quiet. Then he said, You're making this harder than it needs to be. And something inside me clicked into place, because that sentence had followed me my entire life. When I was 17 and overwhelmed, when I said I needed help, when I didn't smile enough, when I didn't comply fast enough. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I realized then that I had spent years making things easier for everyone else, at the cost of myself. And I was done. I told him I loved him, but I wouldn't sacrifice my marriage or my integrity to keep the peace. I told him I wasn't choosing sides, I was choosing reality. When the call ended, I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt clear. Not happy, not relieved. Clear. That night, Benjamin and I talked for a long time. Not about my parents specifically, but about boundaries. About what kind of life we wanted. About what we would and wouldn't accept from the people around us. For the first time, I wasn't asking him to accommodate my family. I was asking myself to protect my future. And that was the real shift. Because power doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from deciding that you're no longer available for manipulation. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces. Small, sharp realizations that spread quietly through the family like cracks in glass. At first, my parents told people I had chosen a man over my family, that I'd been influenced, that I was stubborn and holding grudges. For a while, that story worked. It was simple, familiar, easy to believe. But simple stories don't hold up well under pressure. Michael was the first crack. 2 months after the court hearing, he was arrested for stealing from his job at an electronics store. Thousands of dollars worth of merchandise. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding. Months of deliberate theft. My parents called me the next day. My mother cried and said Michael had made a mistake, that he needed help, that family had to stick together. She asked if Benjamin and I could help pay for a lawyer. I listened without interrupting. Then I said no, not angrily, not dramatically. Just no. I told her we were still recovering financially from the legal costs and the move. I told her I wasn't comfortable helping someone who had lied in court to try to ruin my husband. She exploded. She called me vindictive, petty, unforgiving. She said Michael had only lied because he was protecting his family. That word again. Protecting. My father got on the phone and said this was my chance to prove I was still part of the family. That when you love someone, you help them, even when they're wrong. I told him love didn't mean erasing consequences. That conversation ended badly. Michael pled guilty. He got probation, community service, restitution he couldn't afford. A few weeks later, my parents asked if Benjamin could help Michael get a job at the auto shop. Benjamin tried. The background check failed. When I told my parents, my mother accused Benjamin of sabotaging the opportunity out of spite. She said he could have convinced his boss to overlook it if he really cared. That was when even some extended family members started asking questions. Why was Michael always in trouble? Why did everyone else have to clean up after him? Why did my parents keep demanding help from the same people they'd accused in court? The next crack came quietly. My parents sold their house. They didn't tell me. I found out through social media. When I called to ask about the things we'd left behind, furniture from my grandmother, items she had specifically wanted me to have, my mother said they'd donated most of it. She said she assumed we didn't want it. I realized then that it wasn't forgetfulness. It was punishment. 2 weeks later, Michael was arrested again for violating probation. My mother called from the jail parking lot asking if we could help with bail. I said no. That was the moment everything collapsed. My father told me I'd regret this forever, that family was supposed to help each other, that I was failing some invisible test of loyalty. I told him I would rather handle my own life than keep paying for other people's lies. Michael went to jail. My parents stopped calling. And slowly, quietly, the story they'd told about me started to unravel. People noticed the pattern, the excuses, the demands, the lack of accountability. I didn't have to defend myself. The truth did the work for me. I used to believe family was something you endured. That love meant staying, no matter how heavy the cost. That loyalty meant silence. That being a good daughter meant making yourself smaller so other people could stay comfortable. I don't believe that anymore. Today, my life is quieter. Not empty. Quiet in the way peace is quiet. Benjamin and I moved into a new apartment a month ago. It's not big. It doesn't impress anyone, but it's ours. No one times our showers. No one rearranges our space to prove a point. No one treats love like leverage. We unpacked our wedding gifts and actually used them for the first time. Plates on shelves, towels in drawers, a life built deliberately without commentary. My parents and I haven't spoken in months. Some days that still hurts. I miss the idea of them more than the reality. I miss the parents I thought I had, not the ones who lied, manipulated, and demanded loyalty without accountability. If they ever come back willing to take responsibility, truly take it, I might be open to rebuilding something small and honest. But I won't go back to pretending. I won't apologize for protecting my husband. I won't accept lies in the name of peace. I won't trade my self-respect for approval ever again. What I've learned is this: family isn't defined by blood, it's defined by behavior. By who tells the truth when it's uncomfortable, by who stands up when it matters, by who doesn't ask you to betray yourself to belong. Choosing my husband wasn't choosing against my family. It was choosing a future where love doesn't come with conditions. And that's a choice I would make again, every single time.